Do you know someone who is sexually inappropriate? Trigger warning. Viewer discretion advised. This is taken from the Sexual Preoccupation chapter of the book, Is Your Loved One Mental? 50 Things to Look For, available on Amazon. This book describes 50 unconventional or non-traditional red flags that may indicate the presence of serious mental illness. People having schizophrenia are often more sexually obsessed or preoccupied than non-schizophrenic people. This fixation with sex finds expression in many different ways. Some, very inappropriate, even bizarre. Many of the schizophrenics with whom I have worked have been very sexually promiscuous. The seriously mentally ill are often more indiscriminate about their choice of sexual partners, and may be hypersexual. Of course, this is not true of all people having schizophrenia. Some have been raised in families where modesty was esteemed, and these people have often internalized their family's conservative values, and may be very sexually restrained, maybe even somewhat prudish. A schizophrenic woman with whom I worked frequently mentioned her long-term sexual abstinence, yet all the while introduced the subject of sex into every conversation. She was still sexually fixated, but without the associated sexual acting out behavior. In cases of over-the-top or extreme indiscriminate sexual conduct, the possibility of schizophrenia being present is certainly raised. It is not enough by itself to establish its presence, but it is suggestive, especially when certain other conditions are also present. If, for example, there is extreme sexual promiscuity, despite a very conservative upbringing, this is more suggestive of serious mental illness, because the sexual acting out is at odds with the individual's background. As I discuss elsewhere, schizophrenic people are much more likely to engage in sexual activity with animals than non-schizophrenics, partly as a consequence of their hypersexuality. When someone with schizophrenia becomes sexually aroused, there is a greater chance that they will impulsively act out on that arousal, in a manner considered inappropriate by society. In an aroused state, some, for example, will act out sexually with very young children, if presented with the opportunity. In cases of sexual activity between an adult and a prepubescent child, schizophrenia is more likely present. People who are not seriously mentally ill typically view sexual contact with a prepubescent child to be bizarre, and not even remotely appealing. I recall a schizophrenic man I evaluated, whose history included his having placed his penis inside the mouth of his suckling child. Many mentally ill people will manifest their sexual obsession in other aberrant ways. Some will engage in voyeurism, and may be apprehended by the police for peeping. Adults with reasonably healthy mental and emotional development are unlikely to be drawn to peeping into the windows of others for sexual gratification. Sometimes, the police arrest people for what is called frotteurism, after they have rubbed their private parts against an unsuspecting person in a public setting, such as on a bus or subway train. The schizophrenic may be more easily aroused and often has very poor control over their impulses. When they get turned on, they are likely to sexually act out, including in inappropriate ways. Schizophrenics are very likely overrepresented among those arrested for peeping and frotteurism. Historically, the mental health community has viewed bestiality, that is, sexual activity with an animal, as a sexual attraction to a particular animal, such as would be the case with a sexual fetish. But in my experience, that is almost never the case. Instead, bestiality is the bizarre behavior of a deeply disturbed, sexually unrestrained person. The schizophrenic man who engages in sexual activity with a dog does not have any specific sexual attraction to dogs. He's just horny, has impaired impulse control, and is mentally disturbed enough to engage in behavior that most people would consider disgusting. Schizophrenics do not specifically seek out animals for sex. Instead, they pursue any available avenue for expression of their sexual arousal. One schizophrenic man I evaluated would become so sexually aroused that he would even hump a dirt hole on the grounds of the treatment facility. The state hospital where I interned housed a great many schizophrenic patients, and the patients' lust for sex and cigarettes played out rather interestingly. Male patients would offer female patients a cigarette for sex, and not a pack of cigarettes, a single cigarette. At the hospital, that was the going rate for a sex act. The schizophrenic patients seemed to value sex and cigarettes above all else. The male schizophrenic patient's sexual arousal was so intense that he was willing to part with a beloved cigarette to secure some sex. The female schizophrenic patient's desire for cigarettes was so strong that she was willing to have sex for a single cigarette. The same negotiation applied to homosexual sex, albeit female patients seldom had to barter for sex. While many non-schizophrenic people are very sexually active and promiscuous, usually, they are at least somewhat discriminating in their choice of sexual partners. But this is often not the case where the schizophrenic is concerned. In treatment facilities for the seriously mentally ill, public masturbation is not uncommon, and schizophrenic patients frequently need to be redirected by staff to pleasure themselves in a private setting. Indecent exposure and masturbation in public are more the domain of the schizophrenic. The person arrested for public masturbation or exhibitionism may well have schizophrenia. Such behavior in public is bizarre and reflects hypersexuality, impaired judgment, and very compromised impulse control. Behavior the mentally ill person may engage in, and in which the non-schizophrenic person will seldom participate. Non-schizophrenic people would seldom find exposing their genitals to some unsuspecting person in public to be sexually satisfying, but not so for many a schizophrenic. A schizophrenic man I worked with in a facility for the mentally ill told me that his roommate masturbated in bed, and did so without any effort to conceal his actions. This man would walk into his shared room, and his masturbating roommate would make no effort to cover himself up, and would carry on pleasuring himself. Sometimes, the masturbator would even describe to his roommate the things he would like to do to him sexually. Later, I evaluated the schizophrenic man, who had been propositioning his roommate, and openly pleasuring himself. Interestingly, I recall that during the psychological exam, he made every effort to appear as normal and upstanding as possible. Another mentally ill man told me that he woke up in the middle of the night to find his roommate performing oral sex on him. What was noteworthy about his report, and reflective of his schizophrenia, was that this heterosexual man asked the roommate to stop, but was not angry with him for the unsolicited sexual advance, as most people would be. Some schizophrenics sexually act out considerably around the time of their psychotic break, but then become somewhat prudish, and abstain from sexual behavior for long periods thereafter. I recall a mentally ill woman in her 60s, who had been promiscuous around the time she was first placed in a psychiatric hospital, many years earlier, but this period of promiscuity was short-lived, and followed by long intervals of sexual abstinence. The low-functioning schizophrenic person often has impaired social skills, and may have little genuine opportunity for healthy romantic relationships. A young schizophrenic man I assessed manifested his sexual fixation through compulsive masturbation. He masturbated so frequently that he went through several tubes of lubricating jelly, and even injured the skin of his penis. While masturbation is commonplace, most people have the good sense not to masturbate to the point of physical injury to their genitals, but not some schizophrenics. Often, the schizophrenic person will turn to a sexual partner who is similarly disturbed, or may approach a very inappropriate partner. Some people with schizophrenia make sexual advances toward members of their own family. In cases where one has sexually acted out with someone in their biological family, schizophrenia is often present. People who are not seriously mentally ill will seldom engage in incest, but the psychotic person may disregard social norms, such as the sanction against incest. The mentally disturbed person seems comparatively under-socialized, and freer to engage in behavior that mentally healthy people would avoid. An adolescent schizophrenic I evaluated had been sharing a bed and having sex with her biological brother for years. She told me that she loved her brother and expected to marry him. Her mother, also schizophrenic, knew of the sex between the siblings and made little effort to prevent it. Bizarre sexual fixation will sometimes motivate the schizophrenic to insert foreign objects into their genitals. I have worked with patients who inserted wires and other objects into their penises, and vegetables, cutlery, small toys, and other items into their vaginas. Generally speaking, non-schizophrenics will not do this sort of thing. Bizarre sexual behavior, partly spawned by sexual obsession, often signals the presence of psychotic illness. By learning how to identify the presence of serious mental illness, you will less likely be a victim of senseless violence, and will be better prepared to help the mentally ill. For more on this, and to learn how to spot schizophrenia, I recommend the Mental Things to Look For books, available on Amazon.